Hi. In Armageddon Now, Dwight Wilson, we're on page 112. Now Wilson is turning again to the role of Russia in prophetic speculation in the 1930s. This is the chapter, by the way, mobilizing for Armageddon. The particular role of Russia in the end-time drama and at the Battle of Armageddon received a growing emphasis during the 1930s as Russian power and potential attracted world attention. The 38th and 39th chapters of Ezekiel were fleshed out by an expanding exegesis and continued to identify the various figures. In a sermon at the Assembly of God Church, Springfield, Missouri, Thomas M. Chalmers listed the allies of Russia in Ezekiel 38:6 as Romania, that is Riphath, according to Chalmers, son of Gomer, Armenia and Turkey, that's Togarma in the text, and Germany, Ashkenaz, son of Gomer, in the text. These would assist in the invasion of Palestine, which Chalmers also described. Quote, "The manner of this invasion is given in verse 9. Thou shalt ascend and come like a storm, and thou shalt be like a cloud to cover the land, thou and all thy bands, and many people with thee." And down in verse 16 we have, "Thou shalt come up against my people of Israel, as a cloud to cover the land." In a half a dozen or a dozen years more, I don't think it will be a dozen years, some fine morning the inhabitants of Jerusalem will see a great cloud. In a few minutes the cloud will develop a great cloud of airplanes, landing tens of thousands of men on the soil of Palestine. Note the expression, "they shall ascend," how that describes the rising of a fleet of planes. End of quote. Here, a leading premillenarian spokesman could not tolerate a figurative cloud, but had to have a literal cloud of something, nor could he resist the urge to set a date. Others, such as Louis S. Bauman, came near to succumbing to the date-setting temptation, commenting on the belief of many premillenarians that 1936 or 1937 was the latest possible year for the end of the times of the Gentiles. He stated, "They may not be right. We are inclined to believe they are not far from right." Now, all of these dates in the 30s, of course, had been set according to the year-day theory, based on the writings of men like Grant and Guinness. We've dealt with that before. Bauman, however, readily admitted that there was conflict in the premillenarian ranks over prophetic identifications. Quote, "There has been considerable confusion as to what peoples will make up this great northeastern federation of nations, whose allied hosts shall swoop down upon the people that are gathered out of the nations at the time of the end. It is certain, however, that Russia will be the heart and soul of that great godless federation." Unquote. A few examples of this confusion will suffice. In contrast to the majority of premillenarians who identified Gomer with Germany, evangelist Charles S. Price, in his book, The Battle of Armageddon, identified the descendants of Gomer as living in the Crimea. Oswald J. Smith, disagreeing with C.I. Scofield, Scofield being the famous Scofield of the Scofield Reference Bible, in disagreeing with Scofield, Louis S. Bauman, and many others, Oswald Smith believed that the coming defeat of Russia and the Northern Confederation was not to be the Battle of Armageddon. Armageddon was to come later, after the debris from the battle with Gog had been used for firewood for 7 years. There were even discrepancies in the works of individual scholars, such as Louis T. Talbot, after whom Talbot Theological Seminary, the graduate school of Biola College, was named. In one radio address, Russia, her invasion of Palestine in the last days, and her final destruction at the return of Christ, Talbot commented on Ezekiel 38:8. "We note in verse 8 that God will lead these people, that is Russia, down and on to the battle of Armageddon." Unquote. But in another broadcast, quote, "The judgment of God upon the Russian Confederacy," he said, quote, "The Roman prince and not Gog of Russia is the leader of the enemies of God at Armageddon." Unquote. He then suggested that the 7 years between the defeat of Gog and the Battle of Armageddon would be the period of the Great Tribulation. Confusion also arose over the role of the King of the South, Daniel 11:40. Lewis S. Bauman identified the King of the South as England, allied to Italy as part of the revived Roman Empire. Alva J. McLean, the president of Grace Theological Seminary, also identified this king as England, but as an ally of Russia against Italy. But there was no question about the identification of Russia. Bauman was even able to discover Joseph Stalin in biblical prophecy. In 1937, Bauman published a booklet, God and Gog, or the coming meet between Judah's lion and Russia's bear, in which he included this curious interpretation. Quote, "While we understand that it was not asked with this event in mind, yet Jeremiah's query is appropriate here. Shall iron break the northern iron and the steel?" That's Jeremiah 15:12. Shall iron, that is Rome, break the northern iron, Russia, and the steel, Stalin? It is not without interest to note once more that the bloody-jawed dictator of all Soviets, Joseph, and this is a word I will only guess at, Joseph Stalin's real name is DZCHUGASH, Will. So something like Zhugash Will. Zhugash Will. That is, Joseph Zhugash Will in his youth changes his name to Joseph Stalin, i.e. Joseph Steele. End of quote. This is followed by an amazingly unabashed admission of loose exegesis. Quote, "It matters not what the Spirit of God may have had in mind when he inspired Jeremiah to write these words, nor whether or not the translators correctly translated. As a matter of fact, the iron of Rome is due to grind to powder the northern iron and to pulverize the infidel steel." End of quote. The premillenarian role for Russia had become the measuring stick for Scripture, rather than Scripture being the measuring stick for the interpretation. Not only were the premillenarians confident of their identification of Gog with Russia, but there was nothing preventing the advent of Armageddon now. In the words of Charles S. Price in 1938, quote, "There is nothing to hinder now the hordes of Russia sweeping down through both Turkey and Persia to the very gates of Jerusalem. There is the valley of Armageddon." I'll put in a link to a series of videos we did called Humpty Dumpty Hermeneutics, where we analyze the principle, or the faux principle here, you might say the principle of distortion, where you're taking your doctrines and reading them into Scripture. That's eisegesis, not exegesis. As he says very plainly, and I think correctly here, the premillenarian role for Russia had become the measuring stick for Scripture, rather than Scripture being the measuring stick for the interpretation. That is correct exegetical procedure, not the former. So I'll put in the first of the 2 or 3 videos that are linked together, Humpty Dumpty and the interpretation of Scripture. See you soon.